All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our core partner webinar. Good morning to those of you in North America. Good afternoon to those of you in the UK and Ireland. We are so thrilled that you could join us today for our exclusive core partner webinar on our brand new International Student Research Results Emerging Futures 3. My name is Elle Butler, and I am Head of Marketing for North America at IDP Connect. And as per usual, I am joined by my co-host, Jonah Duffin, Global Director of External Relations. And as you all know, last year we published our first and second iterations of our Emerging Futures research. So today we share with you our Emerging Futures 3, which provides us with the most robust data set yet. Our Emerging Futures research builds on the findings of our previous surveys, but new in this iteration, we dive deeper into the impact of post-study work rights, cost of living, and admission processes on student choice. This webinar will be recorded, and as always, we will share the recording and the slides with you in a follow-up email. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can use the Q&A tool located at the bottom of your webinar window. There's also a chat feature if you'd like to make any comments, and we will cover all of your questions at the end of the session. So as always, we'll dive in and get started here with our methodology for this survey. So Emerging Futures 3 was a survey of prospective students, applicants, currently enrolled, and completed students. It was a 15-minute online survey administered in both English and Chinese, and it was conducted between February 27th and March 19th of this year. Now, one key date to be aware of around this time frame is that on February 21st, just before this survey went into the field, Australia formally announced the extension of their post-study work rights to 5 years. So important to keep that in mind, and we'll see if this influenced student perceptions of Australia at all for this survey. So we'll now take a look at the respondent profile. So excitingly, this was our largest survey ever with 21,000 responses. Now, part of the reason for this many respondents is because we welcomed Intake Education into our company late last year. As you may remember, IDP acquired Intake Education, so we invited their students to participate in this survey as well. However, even without Intake Education, this would still be our largest survey to date. So really exciting that we received so many responses. I do want to note that because Intake is mainly a UK sending agent, we have chosen to exclude their data just from our first section coming up on student destination preferences. Otherwise, the Intake responses skew the results very much to the UK. So to maintain consistency with previous surveys for that section, we've included just the responses for IDP students, but for all subsequent sections, we include Intake responses. And this means we have an extremely rich amount of data across many segments, so more students and more source markets included. So as you can see at the bottom of this slide, we've actually now got Nigeria as our largest respondent market. So that's very exciting. We also see other new markets showing up much higher in the list as well, including Ghana, the Philippines, and Indonesia. But what's interesting and reassuring is that much of the results that we see don't change at all with the inclusion of the intake students. Rather, it more so strengthens the narrative from having all these additional student voices included. So that is great news. And just jumping back up to the top of this slide here, we can see that most respondents are in the prospective or applied stage. And over on the right of this slide, we see that respondents do lean more on the post-grad side. So now we're going to dig into student destination choices and their decision-making. So as I mentioned, this section is the only one that does not include the intake respondents because we don't want to skew it entirely towards the UK. So among IDP students, Canada remains the top choice destination, consistent with previous surveys, with 27% of students indicating it is their first choice destination. This is followed by Australia, and then the US, and then in fourth place, the UK, with New Zealand and Ireland receiving a small share themselves. So what we do when we're looking at where students are choosing to study is we ask them to indicate which country is their first, second, third, and fourth choice, or they can stop after selecting only one or two. So if they're only considering the US and the UK, they might not select any others. But what's interesting is that over a third of students in this study are considering at least 3 out of the 4 major destination countries. So we are seeing steady competition between the 4 major destination countries. So on this slide that we're looking at here, we're taking a look at how those destination choices have changed over time. And to be honest, it hasn't changed a ton. So this is looking at over the last 3 surveys, and we can see that across all of those, Canada saw a 27% of respondents who were choosing it as their #1 destination. For Australia, we saw a bit of a peak as the country reopened following COVID back in August, but that has dropped off slightly to 23%, but it's still ahead of the US and the UK in these surveys. The US is actually the only one that has seen an increase since our last survey, so it has increased by 3 percentage points, while the UK has actually decreased by 2 percentage points here. And again, this is the percentage of students indicating that a destination is their first choice. So next, we're going to talk about primary factors for choosing a first choice destination. And from here onward, we are going to include the intake respondent data. So we asked students, why is your first choice destination your first choice? And here we have global data. So this is not yet broken down by the different destinations. And what you can see is that 61% of all respondents say that the high quality of education is the reason that they're choosing their destination country. This is followed by good employment opportunities after graduation, then safety, then supportive of international students, availability of part-time work, and finally, the country is welcoming to people from other nations. And again, we've included the intake respondents here, but we haven't seen any significant change in this since the last survey, even though we've almost doubled the number of respondents. So this is really confirming that these are the factors most important to international students. So again, this is looking at the global data for all destinations, but now we'll take a look at how this data differs by destination countries. And we can see some variance here by destination country and some differences here in why students are choosing the countries that they are. So at the top here, we can see that Canada is being chosen for a broad number of reasons. It's sort of a well-rounded offering of good employment opportunities, safety, a welcoming country to people from other countries. So really across the board, Canada is performing quite well. And then if we look at Australia, which is second to last here, they are also seen as having a similar well-rounded offering. So they're viewed as safe and supportive, as well as offering a high quality of education. However, if we take a look at the US and the UK, they are being chosen for a much narrower set of reasons. Here we can see that students are much more focused on quality of education here in this first column, 69% of students choosing the UK for this reason, and 66% of students choosing the US. And we don't see as many students here indicating that they're choosing the UK or the US for their good employment opportunities or safety and supportiveness. So a potential action for institutions in the UK and the US is really to drive better post-study work opportunities for students and to work on being seen as more welcoming and more supportive to international students. Whereas Australia and Canada could do some work to drive student perceptions of quality, and we will talk about that a bit more in a future section. So we then asked students, why was your second choice not your first choice destination? Basically, why didn't you choose a country as your first choice? And what we see here is factors are very different to the ones that made people choose their first choice. So the reasons here are much more pragmatic. They're much more about finances and costs. So 3 out of the 5 factors on this slide are around cost. So cost of tuition being too high, cost of living being too expensive, and accommodations not being affordable. We also see students citing issues around student visas, and so we'll touch on that a bit more later on and how that can be improved. And then we also see students saying that they aren't choosing a destination because of an absence of friends and family there. So that one is a bit harder to counter. But again, this relates back to student perceptions of whether a country is welcoming and supportive of international students. And it's why it's so important for countries to be perceived as welcoming. So now we will take a deep dive into looking at quality. As we saw, students are choosing quality as a top reason for choosing their first choice destination. So we wanted to take a bit more of an in-depth look at that. So you might remember on our previous surveys that we asked students to rank destinations on a scale of 0 to 10, and we had flags showing where each country scored. So what we're seeing here on this slide is that same question and same data, but we are showing the average score that respondents chose in terms of how they perceived education quality in each of the major destination countries. So really, it's just a new way of presenting the same data, and the higher the number, the better. So we can see that the US is ranked highest here, closely followed by the UK, and then we've got Canada and then Australia. So this basically shows that the US and the UK are perceived as the best in terms of quality education. And this matches what we saw in the previous section about why students are choosing these destinations as their first choice. So then we wanted to understand how students are determining quality and how they are understanding this factor. So for most countries, it's the graduate employment rate. So you can see that here in the red across the top. So the logic is if you go to a quality institution, you'll naturally have a better chance of getting a job at the end of your education. However, interestingly for the UK, it's the ranking of the institution in the #1 spot, followed by the graduate employment rate, which kind of makes sense because as we've seen, students aren't choosing the UK in large numbers because of the opportunity for work. Rather, they're choosing it for high quality, as we've seen in those previous slides. Then for the UK and the US, students are looking at the quality of academic staff, whereas for Canada, students are actually looking at cost of tuition fees. So interestingly, students are using tuition fees as an indicator of quality of education in Canada, and then they're looking at institution ranking and the quality of academic staff. So quite different ways here in which students are perceiving and understanding quality of education. So an action here for institutions is really to promote your graduate employment rate if you're able to, recognize the importance of rankings, but also talk a bit more about your academic staff and their facilities that you have available to students, which also helps to bolster this narrative around quality of education. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Jonah, who will cover a bit more about student support services and how students are perceiving these.
Thank you very much, Elle, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about support services because I think this gives us a really good platform to then explore other important areas around financial support and accommodation and so forth. So what we're looking at on this slide is prospective students. So by that I mean students who are yet to commence their studies. So they're either looking to study or they've already applied. And what we can see, no matter which destination they're intending to study in, that financial support is the #1 support service that they think they will want and need whilst they are studying. That's interestingly followed by support in finding part-time work. Then for Canada, it's around Canada and the UK, it's around finding support for accommodation. And then we have some mix in terms of its level of importance, but we have careers advice for students to find the career after they graduate. And then we have study skills support. So to really re-emphasize financial support and help in finding part-time work and then accommodation are the three most important factors for prospective students as they research where and what to study. So we've asked a similar question on the next slide of current students, but instead of saying what do you think will be most important, we've asked them what they have actually accessed in terms of the different support services. And what we see is actually quite a difference, a divergence from what students think they'll want to what they're actually accessing. So the #1 is student support. Then we have careers advice for them post their graduation, and then we have the pre-arrival and post-arrival orientation programs. And only after that, with 29%, do we have support in finding part-time work and support in finding suitable accommodation further down the line. If we keep casting our eye further down to the right, we'll see that it's just a fifth that are actually accessing financial support to help with living costs. Now, Ellie's going to talk more about financial support and living costs in the next section. But I think what we're seeing here is a mismatch between what students think they will need and what they're actually accessing. And from the data, it suggests that it's because it's either not promoted or it's not accessible in the way that students want it and need it. And that becomes more apparent if we look on the next slide, which then has asked purely those students who have said that they have accessed these services, what their experiences were of using those support services. So we're actually going to start at the bottom of the slide, because there you can see financial support. So just a reminder for those prospective students, stated to be the most important piece of support that they could receive, but only around a quarter actually accessing it in reality. And then when we look at the experiences, it's the one that has is least meeting student expectations. So the more orange and red there is on any one bar, the less expectations being met. And we can see we have 23% of students saying it was less than the expectation they had, and 10% saying much less. Now, overall, there are some good results and positive results on this slide, but I think that begins to build a narrative that what students will want and need isn't necessarily available to them, or when it is, it's not quite meeting their needs, which is a really good foundation for Elle to now talk a little bit more about what students want and need when it comes to financial support.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonah. So at the end of our last survey, a lot of students indicated they wanted more financial support. So we wanted to dive a bit deeper into that to understand the nuances of exactly what they're looking for. So in this survey, we asked them, what kind of financial support are you seeking? And the majority of students indicated that they want more opportunities to help themselves. So they want help with finding part-time work. They do want more discounted tuition fees and discounted accommodation, and help to cover cost of living, as well as budgeting advice and guidance. But the majority of students say they really want help in finding part-time work. We then asked students about perceptions around cost of living. So again, we're back to our 0 to 10 scales, and the higher the number here is what students consider as more expensive cities, or sorry, more expensive countries. So the UK is viewed as the most expensive destination country in terms of cost of living, followed by the US, followed by Australia, and then Canada. And again, just to emphasize, these are perceptions. So obviously a campus in London will be much more expensive than a rural campus somewhere. So there is a lot of nuance within these, but these are students' general overall perceptions. So then on our next slide, we wanted to understand how students are researching the cost of living. So how are they learning about cost of living? And I found this quite interesting and surprising. So 55% of students say that they're learning about cost of living through friends and family. So there's sort of a hearsay element to it. And then you see institution websites. So this raises the question, do all institutional websites have clear and up-to-date information on how much it will cost students to study and live there? So an important consideration for institutions. And then we're also seeing students citing independent websites, government websites, and school advisors as sources of information for cost of living. We also asked students, how knowledgeable are you about the amount of money you would need while living overseas? So that's over here on the left of this slide. And we can see that only 21% of students state that they are highly knowledgeable about how much studying overseas will actually cost them, with 55% of students saying that they have some knowledge. We also asked students over here on the right if they are confident that they will have enough money to live. So globally, students are actually quite confident that they have enough money to study, even though they're relying on parents and friends to tell them how much it will cost. And even though they're admitting that they don't really know how much it will cost themselves in quite high numbers here on the left. So 61% are confident that they have enough money to live. However, 13% say they aren't confident, and a further quarter are not sure. So these stats together show that there is a confidence that is not really matched by students' knowledge level, and this mismatch needs to be bridged with better communications from institutions. So we also then asked students who will fund your international education, and 42% say that their parents will be the funder. So again, this shows that family are really a key audience when it comes to what your institution is communicating about finances. So we must make sure that information is really tailored to this audience. 31% of students are saying that they will self-fund their studies through part-time work. Over a quarter are saying a scholarship from the institution, and then some are saying loans. So I do want to call more attention here to this 31% in second place, saying that they will fund their studies through their own part-time work, because this is a really significant proportion, and it speaks to what we've already seen in the findings about the importance of part-time work to students and how they need and want institutions to help them find that part-time work. So ahead on our next slide, we also asked students, have the recent increases to cost of living made you reassess studying overseas? And here over on the left, we're looking at the global results. We can see that just over half of students say that they are rethinking their decision to study overseas due to increases in cost of living. When we look at that by destination country, we can see this rises to a significant 67% for those who have New Zealand as their first choice. And we see Australia also slightly above half here with 53%. So this is a bit of a red flag for institutions, because we can see that the rising cost of living may be a key factor impacting conversion rates. So we might see that students are less likely to accept their offer and follow through to enrollment due to rising cost of living. So because we saw that part-time work is a really important factor to students and that many want to fund their studies through their own part-time work, I'll now hand it back to Jonah, who will have a bit more of a deep dive into part-time work.
Thank you, Elle. Just got a couple of slides on part-time work because it was so important. So it's what students want help with. That's the biggest support service they want. And we've got nearly a third of them saying that that's going to be the main way in which they fund their studies. So we asked them whether they intended to work and in what numbers. And you can see here, we've split it up in a quite a dense data heavy slide in terms of the different source countries. And you can see two key themes from this. The first being that students who are from African countries, so Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya, have the highest intention to work part-time whilst they study. So you've got over 90% from those three countries saying that they will be working part-time. And then you have slightly lower numbers when it comes to some of the South Asian countries, so Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, lower, and then lower still as well for Indonesia. So the larger the blue part of the pie chart, the more students intend to study. So then we can split that data, exactly the same data, another way. We can look at it in terms of their first choice destination, so where they're intending to study. And here you see that whilst it's the same data, that Canada at 86%, so higher than all of the other destinations in terms of students' intention to study, higher than the US on 82%, New Zealand and Ireland both on 81%, UK on 78%, and then Australia on 77%. It is quite interesting that Australia has the lowest percentage of intention to work, as they recently removed the cap on the number of hours that students could work, but that's not coming through in this data. And when you have access to all of the dashboards next week, you'll be able to have a look at why, and it tends to be that students are attracting Australia is attracting students from countries where they're less reliant on part-time work compared to the students that places like Canada are attracting. And so there's a lot of complexity within the data, but overall as a theme, seeing students as the cost of living rises, having a real reliance and need to be supported in finding part-time work, but then once they are working, a recognition and help from and support from universities as students balance part-time work and study at the same time. So I'm going to hand over, I think, one last time to Elle for an accommodation section, and then I will take you through to the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonah. And we've noted earlier that some students aren't choosing countries as their first choice destination due to issues around cost of accommodation. So we wanted to understand a bit more about student perceptions and attitudes here. And we want to explore this because there's a lot of pressure on institutions and destination countries around accommodation, especially in key cities such as Toronto, Dublin, London, Manchester, and so on across the world. So we wanted to understand student thoughts in terms of whether they would leave their home country without accommodation lined up. So if they would travel to their destination country without accommodation already secured. And what we found here is that it's about half and half. So this top half here is the students who want to secure accommodation upon arrival, and the bottom half are students who would like to secure it before they arrive in the country. And there's some slight variance here by destination country. Interestingly, Canada is the only one where the majority of students are saying that they will secure it upon arrival. So taking a look at the next slide here, we asked students, if you were not able to secure accommodation, what would you do? With their choices being, starting from the bottom, I won't travel. In the middle, I will reassess, and I will keep my study plans as this top section. So you might recall from our previous surveys that we frequently see this trend where students who are interested in Canada are quite loyal. We've called it sticky in the past. So they are committed to studying in Canada, and there aren't many things that would deter them from choosing or switching to a different destination, even something as major as not being able to secure accommodation. So we see here 50% of those students interested in Canada are saying that they would keep their study plans for Canada even if they couldn't find accommodation. Now here we can see that this is significantly lower for students looking at the US, who are less loyal to the destination, perhaps due to the realities of the costs, so they are more likely to switch throughout the process. So while this slide is mostly looking at the responses by destination country, we did include one source market over here on the right because it really stood out to us. So here you can see that for students in China, 73% of them say that they won't travel to a destination if they are not able to secure their accommodation. 22% say they will reassess their plans, and only 5% are committed to keeping their study overseas plans. So a much more cautious approach that we're seeing from Chinese students. And we could speculate that perhaps COVID has only intensified this effect as we see the numbers of Chinese students on our campuses dropping. So for Chinese students, there's clearly work that universities need to be doing in order to convert them, in order to give them the reassurance that they need to travel to the destination country. So it's worth considering how your institution is communicating about this to Chinese students, how they're making them confident before they leave, and how they're providing communications around accommodation. So at this time, I will once again pass it back to Jonah to cover more about student perceptions of admissions.
Thanks, Ellie. We're now going to have a brief look at admissions. There is a lot more data within the findings, and invite people to go in and have a look at those dashboards when they're available next week and have a hunt around. We just wanted to bring sort of three headlines to your attention. So the data on the slide is actually from three different questions. It's three separate data points. So that the first, the blue circle, it shows that 46% of students said that they got a decision on their application within 4 weeks. The yellow shows that 83% of students think that 6 weeks is an unacceptable time to wait for an application decision. So if you want students to convert in larger numbers, then application turnaround time of 6 weeks for the vast majority is unacceptable. It needs to be much quicker than that. And 47% of students, and nearly half of students that we surveyed, said they will start looking to switch to a different institution or different destination if they haven't had a decision within 4 weeks. So there's quite a difference from 47 to 83. So you can see that there's much more of an impetus to turn around applications at least within a month. But the data suggests that the quicker you can turn around applications, the better, and less than half of students are currently getting it according to this data within 4 weeks. So again, you can go into the data and look at that in terms of different destination countries and different source countries, but broadly this tells the story of admissions needing to be faster. We've got similar information on visa processing, and we looked at this in the previous surveys as well. Again, we're looking at two different data sets here and comparing them. So if we take Canada as the first example there on the left-hand side. So the first bar, 17% of students received a visa within 4 weeks of applying. 61% of students would be reconsidering their choice to study in Canada if they didn't receive a visa within 4 weeks. So if you wanted this data to look better, you need the bar on the left-hand side to be longer than the bar on the right-hand side. So Australia and the UK have managed that. So you've got the majority, 67% for Australia getting their visa within 4 weeks, and you've got 62% saying they would reconsider if they didn't. It's better outcomes for the UK in the orange, with 70% of students, the highest number of all the different destinations, saying they got their visa within 4 weeks, but you've got 62% saying they would reconsider. And then another theme that Elle pulled out is students who have their first choice of the US always tend to be slightly less loyal to that destination. So they have the highest number of students who say they would reconsider if they didn't receive a visa within 4 weeks. And they have 43% of students who receive it within 3 weeks. So slow, but not as slow as Canada in terms of visa turnaround time there. So we're now going to go on to one of the final sections, which looks at post-study work. And if you are paying attention and can remember when Elle started the presentation, she looked at the different variables and factors that drove people to choose any institution as their or any destination country as their first choice. And the post-study work rights and post-study work opportunities were very, very high on that list. So we've obviously got a lot of data on that. So looking at this first slide, we asked students whether they will be applying for a post-study work visa, and almost 3/4, 72% said that they will be applying for a post-study work visa. Then we said globally, is it an influencing factor in terms of where you choose to study? And 63% of students said it was either the main reason or an influencing factor in where they chose to study, into the destination country they chose to study. So a large number, 63%, saying that it had an influencing factor. And then close to half, so 44% of students said they would think about changing their study destination if the duration of the post-study visa was shortened. So you're beginning to see a picture here of the importance of post-study work in students' decision making in a little bit more detail. We can go into further detail on the next slide and begin to look at those perceptions. And again, this is looking at that scale of 0 to 10 in terms of students' perceptions of two elements. The first, graduate opportunities. So what opportunities are available to them in a country when it comes to employment. And then the second is the policy within those countries that they're judging. So the higher the number, the more positive their perceptions. So starting on the left with Canada in the red, Canada has the most positive perceptions from all of our respondents in terms of the opportunities that are available to them for employment when they graduate, and the policies that are in place at the moment for post-study work for international students. We then have the US, and we see it's one of the only countries here where we see a gap between what students perceive to be relatively positive views on the graduate opportunities available in the US. They think they will get a job when they graduate, but a gap in terms of more negative perceptions around the policies. So students don't believe that the policies in the US are particularly supportive for them, but they think they will get a job anyway. If you skip over to the right to the UK, sorry, Carolyn, and then you see that the graduate opportunities and the post-study work policies, they match up, 6.8 for both, but it's the lowest in terms of the employment opportunities available as students view it, and it's just slightly ahead by 0.1 in terms of the policies ahead of the US. So not great perceptions to the UK, but as we saw in those very early slides, people choosing the UK because of quality rather than necessarily the post-study work opportunities available. Now we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. We wanted to understand a little bit more and delve a little bit deeper in terms of what aspects of a visa, the post-study work visa, were most important to students. I think some of the findings on here are surprising, were surprising to me, and need unpacking a little bit. So 65% of students said what was important about a post-study work visa was the opportunity to acquire work experience, and just over half said it was the ease of entry into the job market once they've graduated. It was just under half who said that it was the duration of the visa that was important to them. So you could argue and say, well, a lot of the lobbying, a lot of the campaigning, and a lot of the policy work is centered on the duration of the visa, Australia's worked hard to bounce back, and extending the post-study work rights by a number of years has been a key policy element of that. So were they right or wrong to do so? And I would say that they were entirely right to do so. That it is the headline figure. It's what catches the student headlines, and what students hang on to and remember. I think it also attracts employers to employ more international students if they know that they can be within their workforce and labour market for a good number of years. So still remains very, very important that we have good post-study work rights over a good period of years. But I think also what this slide and this data highlights is what institutions can do to influence student choice, and be of more help to students. And I think universities can do more in terms of introducing students into the labour market once they graduate, making it easier for that transition from graduation into full-time work. And in doing so, and in enabling more students, you get more word of mouth, able to promote what you're doing, then I think you'll be seen as more attractive to international students. So I think real actionable insight for institutions and for policymakers and governments from this data. So we then looked at what factors are important to students in understanding if an institution has good graduate outcomes. This is a question that we asked in the previous survey as well, and the findings remain relatively unchanged. So the academic reputation of an institution is really important. If a student thinks that the education is good and it is reputable, then that will then lead on to them having a good CV with a good name on it, and helping them to get the job that they want. Also, where available, published graduate employment rates are really important to students. Only then in third place is it the post-study work rights in the country, and then ranked fourth overall by students was the links that a university has with industry. So reputation, really important, and it's probably where the UK is doing relatively well, because academic reputation is so high, but then employment rates and post-study work rights. That's why places like Canada are also doing so well, because they're able to show the return on investment and the ease of transition into the labour market to future students. So I think we've gone through a huge amount of data. We've tried really hard this time to just bring you some of the key highlights, and we tried to present it in ways that we hope are more accessible and easier to quickly understand. Like I have said a few times, we will be publishing all of the dashboards so that those of you who are so inclined can really delve into the data and understand a little bit more about it. And we'll also be providing you with a recording of this webinar and a pack with all of the data that we've presented today. So thank you, everybody, and hopefully Ellie's been scouring the Q&A for any questions that we may have. I'll see if I can answer them.
Definitely, yes. So we have had a few questions pop up here. So one of those being for the slide about who is going to fund students' education. Was there a difference between those applying to graduate programs versus undergraduate programs?
Yes, there was. I can't remember the exact data, but there was a slight bias towards students who are studying postgraduate programs were more likely to be self-funded or reliant on part-time work, whereas those who are undergraduate are much more likely to be reliant on their poor old parents.
Interesting, thank you. Do you think the lower propensity of Indonesian students who intend to work is impacted by the number of scholarship students from this market, or do you think that that is unaffected?
We haven't done this work yet, but we would be able to cross-reference that and see that, and anybody using the dashboards with as well, you can cross-reference by what the funding that the student will be using predominantly to fund their course, so parents, scholarships, and so forth, and then cross-reference that with the other data to find that out. So I think it's a good presumption to make, but haven't done the data crunching to be able to say yes or no definitively.
Excellent. Why do you think Chinese students in particular are so concerned about having accommodation before they travel versus non-Chinese students?
So this is a question that came up in the Australian webinar as well that took place this morning, and I think there's some. So we had a little look, and whilst we haven't done the full data crunching, what we can see is that students from South Asia and from especially places like India, they're more willing to travel without having secured accommodation because they are more likely to be able to be housed with friends and with family upon arrival. They have those links, and their expectation of accommodation is that they will be staying in greater numbers with friends, family, or in multiple person accommodation. When we look at the same data for Chinese students, what we see is that there's much more of a desire for single occupancy accommodation and less reliance on friends and family. So it then makes sense that they're less likely to want to study because they don't have those backup plans available to them on arrival, and therefore want to secure it before arrival. So that could be one of the reasons that we see such a high number, and it is a high number compared to everybody else. There isn't that level of differentiation between other source markets as we saw for Chinese students.
Yeah, so interesting. And again, it's why it's so important for institutions to really communicate with this market, to reassure them that there is accommodation for them, to help them in securing it as well. So fascinating. I see we have a question in the chat about, do we have student experiences by country? I'm not sure which specifically, which section this is referring to, but all of our survey questions can be broken down by source market. So we are able to see the differences there. Any other questions we are happy to answer? Okay, see we have what are the demographics of students, for example, mature adult learners looking to study part-time while working, and what level of programs are they seeking, post-secondary, postgraduate, and what types of courses are they looking for? Short courses, micro-credentials, for example.
So it was part-time work that we saw coming through as really important. We haven't got any breakdown of part-time study versus full-time study. My assumption is that because of the importance of visas, that the vast majority of people within the survey are looking for full-time study and then to work part-time alongside that. So we saw, I think it was just under 60% of the responses are from students wanting to study postgraduate, and a quarter those wanting to study undergraduate. We have recorded all of the preferences in terms of course and subject type as well. So that's in the data. We can look at it in more detail, but from the work we've done so far, we haven't seen any sort of changes in preferences dependent on what courses or disciplines students want to study. It's not something that is driving different motivations and different outcomes. I think that answers the question. I've just seen another one come in, Elle, around LATAM, and unfortunately, this data doesn't include Latin America. So we've managed to get a lot more responses from Africa and certain parts of Southeast Asia, but no LATAM yet.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, next one that just came in. Do you have data or do you plan to collect data on graduate outcomes? From some of the slides shared, it seems that there are differing perceptions pre-arrival versus post-arrival. So it'd be helpful to understand if the same is true once students reach the point of study plan completion. So did those who felt that they had the ability to stay and work post-graduation go on to do so, or is this really only a nice to have?
I think that's we would love to have that data, and there's some initial work within the wider IDP to look at how we can collect that data, but it's difficult, and so I think that's probably all I can really say at the moment, is that that data is incredibly important to students, and we want students to be able to make the very best decisions and have the right information available to them. So if we can do that in the future, then we certainly will look to do that. But nothing in the short term at the moment that we've got there.
So stay tuned on that. All right. Well, with that, I think we will close. So we want to thank you all so much for joining us for this session. As Jonah mentioned, the dashboards will be live for you next week so that you can go in and interrogate the data yourselves. And following this session, we will send you a recording and the pack of slides as well. As always, please feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions. We love to stay engaged with you. And see, one last question just hopped up, so I will throw that your way, Jonah, if that's okay. Regarding institutional reputation, are the students' perspectives more broad, or do they consider reputation at the level of the field they want to pursue?
Well, that's a really good question. I haven't looked at that yet. I haven't looked at that. So we can certainly look at that. The other thing I just realized when you're doing your wrap, Elle, is that for the first time we've collected data on the different regions of countries. So whether that's states in the US or the provinces in Canada, I think is the right term. Apologies if not. And then by England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales for the UK. So when going into the data, we can compare the different regions of the major destination countries as well. And there's some really rich data in there. So that's a future project for us in terms of analysis. But yeah, be part of the dashboard.
Definitely. So some real granularity there on the dashboards. Excellent. Well, thank you all once again. As I noted, we will send out the recording and the pack following this call. Very grateful to all of you who could join us today, and we will see you next time.